Whooping Crane Chronicles is a collection of stories to learn from, to ponder, and to celebrate. I'm Mike Forsberg, a conservation photographer from the Great Plains. I've spent the last 5 years, camera in hand, exploring the natural history of whooping cranes across the continent, meeting the people who love them, and discovering how these tall, magnificent, and rarest of cranes are navigating our 21st century world. This podcast elevates conservation stories and uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Today, we are at the White Lake Wetlands Conservation Area in southwest Louisiana, in the heart of Cajun country, where conservationists with the state are trying to reestablish a wild, non-migratory population of whooping cranes that were historically here until around 1950. On this episode, we will be chatting with Sara Zimorski and Eva Szyszkoski, who are biologists with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries and work on the whooping crane recovery effort. Good to see you two.
Yeah, good to see you too. Welcome back.
Thanks. When was the last time I was here? About a year ago?
The
I can't
captures?
even remember.
Oh,
That was several years ago.
About 2 years ago? Maybe 2 years ago, almost this time. Maybe January 2023, I think is.
yeah.
I think.
It all blends together.
It does.
It's time for more boudin balls. Yeah, what's the truck stop we like?
Pedos.
Pedos, yeah.
We might go by there today.
Okay. Are we still rocking the same music in the truck?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Stay tuned for that, folks. All right, so let's, for our listeners, let's give a little background to who you two are. So, Sara, I'll start with you.
Okay.
Who are you, why are you here, and where are you from?
I am Sara Zimorski. I am originally from Charlottesville, Virginia, and am a biologist here with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries.
All right. Charlottesville, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a long ways from here.
Yep, but by way of Baraboo, Wisconsin at the International Crane Foundation. So Virginia to Wisconsin, Wisconsin down here.
All right. Eva, how about you?
I'm Eva Szyszkoski. I'm originally from Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And I also came to Louisiana through Wisconsin.
Wow. So you're a Youper.
Yes, I am.
All right. Proud
Yes.
to be a Youper. Yeah. And do you both still have family up north?
Yeah, my parents and one of my brothers still live up in the UP. And then a lot of my mom's family is up there too.
Have you acclimated to being down here in the humidity and
I
the
think as much as you can.
yeah? You got snow last month, right?
Yes, that was amazing.
How much did you get here?
Where I live, where Sara and I live, we got about 8 inches of snow.
Yeah.
That stayed on the ground for at least 2
Couple
days.
days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Historic snowfall.
What did everybody do here?
I was outside
Yeah.
playing in it, and I know a lot of other people who were outside playing in it because it was, a historic event.
Yeah. Right.
Lots of, although when I went out walking, I didn't see tons of other people, but I saw lots of evidence of people playing in their yards, snowmen and other stuff. So I think people were out, but
Yeah.
how far they ventured,
Yeah.
given, especially the first day when it was pretty deep for people who've never seen snow or hardly seen more than an inch or something. It was pretty significant.
What'd the wildlife do here?
Good question. I'm sure they were fine, although I think they're reporting some fish kills, but
Yeah.
Just like cold shocked
I
and
think so.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have seen it, but didn't venture out driving to see it myself.
I did get a lot more songbirds at my feeders than I have in the past.
did you? Yeah. Yeah. What do you think the whooping cranes did down here?
Probably just hunkered down and wrote it out. I would have loved to have seen pictures of them in the snow down here. I mean, we know they're very cold, hardy birds, and they deal with snow and ice in Wisconsin and other places in the Eastern Flyway, where they spend the winter and migrate. But it would have been something to see birds down here standing in snow. Or we have seen our birds standing like on the frozen marsh when we've gotten cold weather, but not in inches of snow.
Yeah.
So.
I remember a few years ago down in Texas, when they had their first Cold Coast episode where it got really cold for a real long time. And I know that, people like Liz Smith and Carter Crouch and others with ICF were getting phone calls worried about the whooping cranes. And they're just like, whooping cranes are just fine.
Yeah.
In fact, they turned into, eating big fish. They'd wade out like herons into the bay, and the fish weren't all dead. They were just cold shocked. And so you had these big fish steaks. Eat about 2 a day and they were done.
I'm actually surprised that we haven't had more people ask us about them, because sometimes in the past they've asked us like, oh, how do the birds do during storms or
mostly hurricanes,
but
yeah. We'll circle back to this later in our conversation, but let's talk about it now too. How many people around here know about whooping cranes? What's the, like, I saw whooping cranes on a license plate in New Orleans.
Oh, good.
The other day.
Was it Richard or Rebecca's, or just a
No.
Okay.
No, it actually wasn't. Yeah, it was in a neighborhood in downtown New Orleans.
Excellent.
And, endangered species license plate with whooping crane on it.
See, now I want to know who that person is. I always wonder when I see one, who is that person?
Yeah, well, so this program to reintroduce, or how do you say are we reintroducing a population in Louisiana? Are we recovering a population, or what? How would you all characterize bringing whooping cranes back to Louisiana? And maybe we can talk, historically about these birds and that they were here. Because most folks that I talk to about whooping cranes have absolutely no idea that there were whooping cranes along the Gulf Coast of Texas and up and around the Carolinas, and whether or not they migrated or not, I know.
Yeah.
We can't spin the clock back necessarily, but what do we know about these birds here historically, and what happened to them? Why are they here today?
I think it is one of the sort of least known areas historically about whooping cranes. I mean, you can say too, but when I worked at ICF, I think it was a long time before I ever heard about whooping cranes having historically been in Louisiana. And I learned a lot more even after I came down here. So I just think that the Louisiana history was not sort of well known or talked about as much or something. But yeah, they're a native species and were historically found in Louisiana. Historical records indicate both migratory and non-migratory birds or populations were down here. And so our work and our effort is to I think we typically say reintroduce, to reintroduce a population and get a population established here again.
Yeah. And that's been going on since when?
The first birds were released here in Louisiana in early 2011.
So that's
14 years.
14
We can do basic math.
And were both of you at the ground level?
I came in 2015, so like 4 years after it started.
I was here from the beginning, so I came just before we received the first group of birds to release in early 2011. Okay. There had been obviously a lot of work to lay the groundwork, permits, and build the pen, and so a lot had been done before I officially came on board, but I came and have been here since the first birds.
So, and you were at ICF before. I mean, I know both of you were. Sara, you were there for several years. You were part of the reintroduction of the Wisconsin eastern migratory population too. Take me from Charlottesville to ICF.
Yeah.
You're a biologist, obviously.
Yeah, it started with an internship with ICF.
Were you in college at the time?
It was after I had graduated.
Okay.
And the funny thing is, I don't even remember specifically applying to the ICF internship because I was sending out so many applications to all kinds of sort of wildlife type things.
Sounds familiar, right?
I think it had been a while since I'd sent my application in, and the curator at the time who hired the interns, the picture you saw earlier in my office,
right.
if he didn't have a position at the time, because I think they sort of have intern positions at different times of the year. And so if they get applications and don't have an opening, then sometimes he would keep applications. And so I'd forgotten and then got a call. And so it started with an internship. And then that was just before the Eastern migratory population reintroduction was getting started. And so then I was hired for a full-time job there. So I sort of got a nice balance of experience working with the captive birds at ICF and then with that reintroduction prior to coming down here for this.
Well, I think the first time I saw you, it wasn't in person. I saw you on a documentary film.
What's it called?
I don't know. I want to say Fly Away Home, but that's with the geese.
Oh, no. And that's really that documentary. I know that the Nebraska Public Television thing.
Oh, well, Crane's Song. Yeah, Crane's Song. That's right. Yeah, so the opera. But tell our listeners a little bit about the Operation Migration Reintroduction first as a context, because we'll sort of play it off of what's happening down here.
Okay, so that reintroduction, the Eastern migratory reintroduction of whooping cranes, was sort of started with the idea of needing to show birds a migration route. And there was an organization led by a couple of Canadians who had done some work to teach Canadian geese to fly behind their ultralight aircraft. And I think it started just sort of for kicks, like somebody's up flying and there's a bird that flies along, and then they realized they might be able to use this for scientific purposes, and so they convinced the Fish and Wildlife Service and all the various other state agencies, ICF, like, let's try this. And so in 2000 we did a practice year with sandhill cranes to see, like, could the sandhill cranes be trained to fly behind the ultralight.
And these are captive reared birds.
Reared birds, and that worked. And so then in 2001, it was done with whooping cranes, and then continued that for a long number of years so that the birds would learn a migration route. And it was very successful at getting that migration route established. And so my role in that was I often would track those birds south in the fall and then spend the winter in Florida monitoring those birds before they headed back north.
How would you track them?
Often I was in an airplane, tracking from an airplane. So the birds had radio transmitters, and we could follow those radio transmitters. And then we also often had, especially as the numbers grew larger and we were tracking birds from previous years, would have folks. Eva was one of those folks later on who would be tracking often from a ground vehicle.
It sounds pretty sexy. I mean, that's a pretty great job, isn't it? Was it all fun?
Tracking a bird who's flying from a vehicle can be quite stressful.
It's hard. It sounds fun, and it's fun looking back on it.
It's fun when you find them at the end of the day.
Has it worked?
That project or that population?
Yeah.
Parts of it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's very clearly an established population and migration route that the birds now, follow on their own and are able to continue navigating. There's certainly been challenges, and that population hasn't seen as much reproductive success as we need and as we'd hope, which is something that we also are experiencing down here in sort of a different way. But there's a population of whooping cranes in the Eastern Flyway, and they migrate back and forth and do their thing for most of the year. So
yeah, there also was an attempt to reestablish a non-migratory whooping crane population in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that one started before the Eastern migratory population began, but they experienced high adult mortality and low reproduction. So that was discontinued, I think, around 2008.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It must be hard.
I think that's the thing. It is hard to reintroduce whooping cranes.
Yeah. Why?
It's a good question. Well, the landscapes certainly have changed since there were cranes in some of these areas before.
Meaning there's a lot more of us in it. Yeah.
And
all the things that come with us. So power lines, roads, development. I think each population has had different issues. Some related to obviously their unique locations or habitat, but some of it's probably just related to whooping cranes have a lot of challenges just with their life history and sort of how they're built.
Well, I often get asked, why are they trying to put whooping cranes in other places? I come from the Great Plains and live in Nebraska, and so the whooping cranes we hear about typically are the birds that are, the relic, wild, self-sustaining migratory population that now is a little over 500 birds, went from a low of less than 20, moving between wood buffalo and the Gulf Coast of Texas, mostly around Aransas. But why try to put whooping cranes in other places besides that migratory flyway?
Go for it. So one of the thoughts behind creating different populations of whooping cranes was in case there was some sort of natural disaster or disease spread through one of the populations, then there would still be other populations in the United States. And
so sort of spread the wealth a little bit.
yeah,
like
don't put all your eggs in one basket type of situation.
It's like a safety net. If you have physical distance between, if all your birds aren't in the same place, then if something bad happens, then in one place, then hopefully it's not happening in a distant, separate location.
Well, I'm remembering, the historical maps that we know best about whooping cranes, and these birds were really spread out across North America. And they weren't necessarily in the mountains or out in the middle of the desert somewhere, but man, they covered a lot of territory, and they're more wetland obligate creatures. And
when we used to have more wetlands and wet meadows and more of that kind of habitat.
Yeah, and in fact, I know the densest population of whooping cranes, at least what science knows today, was in the northern tallgrass prairies, in terms of nesters anyway, in Iowa, southern Minnesota, and folks don't think about those birds very much as coming from there. So this is the non-migratory whooping crane population right now here in Louisiana. Why don't these birds migrate? And is there a difference between them and the birds that are migrating?
We know that there were non-migratory whooping cranes that were here historically and migratory birds, and I don't know if we know sort of 100% certainty what came first, but it seems likely that you get non-migratory from some migratory birds who at some point just didn't go for whatever reason. That just seems to be sort of the most likely scenario. And then if they're in a place where they can stay and make a living, and it's like, this is great here, why would I spend the energy to go somewhere else? But mostly in cranes, migration is a learned behavior, and so that's why for the eastern migratory reintroduced population, the ultralight was used, because you had to teach a migration route without other birds to show the juveniles that are going to be released or reintroduced a migration route. You need a substitute. Obviously that was it worked, but it was very logistically complicated. And here in Louisiana, we know that there used to be non-migratory birds, and so that's less logistically complicated. It's basically easier if you don't have to teach birds to migrate. And they have everything they need here year round. They don't have to, except for a couple weeks ago, you don't have to worry about snow and ice, so they can have whatever they need year round. And so without being taught a migration route, then they're mostly going to stay around here, and they don't need to go anywhere else to find what they need. So
that's a good explanation. I guess I keep thinking about migration for these birds anyway, is a learned behavior. It's not hardwired.
Mostly.
Yeah.
Have you ever had? Well, go ahead.
Oh, and like Sarah said, they don't need to go anywhere. So I think another kind of push for migration for the birds in the north, they sort of need to leave in the winter to survive. So, but yes, we have had birds do some crazy stuff. We had 2 males one year, 2 juvenile males go into southern Canada. We think probably on their own.
Now, hang on a minute.
Yes.
So they went where?
They went into southern Saskatchewan. They both were carrying remote transmitters, although one of they weren't working super great. And then one of the birds disappeared while it was up there. And the other one came back down, maybe with sandhill cranes. I think he spent some time with a group of sandhill cranes, and there was one migratory whooping crane he wasn't really associating with it, but it was in the same flock near Lubbock, Texas. And then he sort of came back towards Louisiana, but he ended up dying. So we didn't have anybody do that again. But we have had other birds do some other kind of crazy movements. We had a juvenile female, pretty much right after she was released, leave, go into eastern Louisiana. She made a big loop through Florida, Alabama, maybe got into Georgia a little bit. And then she ended up doing this kind of east-west migration from Oklahoma to the Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge in Alabama.
What?
And would dip into Louisiana very briefly, usually I think on her way back to Oklahoma. But then she ended up dying in Arkansas. But she did that for like a number of years.
3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an instinctual component, even though we say it's mostly learned, and they don't have to leave here, but for whatever reason, if they do, they still have an ability to navigate.
Yeah.
Now, why they go somewhere or, do some of those random movements. And honestly, we were just completely lucky to capture some of those random odd things with transmitters, because that data, those birds would have disappeared, and unless somebody saw them and reported them, we wouldn't have been finding them here in Louisiana, but we wouldn't have had any idea that they were in Oklahoma or Arkansas or Canada. So it's pretty fascinating, but it just shows that they have an ability to navigate if they need to.
Yeah.
Why they sort of put themselves in that situation or choose to. Yeah. They're very sort of random, and it's been, a very small number of birds that have done sort of crazy extreme things like that. But
well, I learned something new today.
yeah.
It's a good day when you learn something new. I'm like 3 days in a row I've learned something new.
Oh, that's a good stretch.
It is. I got so much to learn. Well, Eva, 2015 you came on at ICF?
2015 I came down here to Louisiana, but I did also work on the eastern migratory population.
Yeah.
I started as a Fish and Wildlife Service intern in 2007.
Up in Nisita?
In Nisita. And then I was an intern for the International Crane Foundation for a year, and then I became their tracking field manager. So I didn't do anything really with the captive birds at ICF, but I did year-round stuff on the EMP.
Okay. And the first time you two met?
When she was first hired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did a little bit of captive stuff at ICF while the chicks were being reared there before they got moved to Nisita for release. But
so you two have worked together for how long?
It'd be like 18 years.
Oh my God. You finish each other's sentences.
Probably sometime.
I mean, to me, you two are like the dynamic duo down here. You're not wearing your capes today, but
I forgot.
From my perspective, you're two superheroes. It's remarkable what you do.
Thank you.
And I don't know where these birds would be without you two, frankly. Can you tell people a little bit about I know it's not fair to say what is a typical day, but let's maybe roll through put people in your shoes through the cycle of the seasons first down here in Louisiana, sort of like a rancher and their cycle of the seasons where they move from calving to branding to release into the summer pasture and back again. What's that cycle like?
We'll start in the summer months.
Okay. and what is summer?
Well,
it feels like all
most
year.
of the year. But I'm talking more like July, August, September, is really like our slower field season. So we're in the office a lot more doing stuff on our computers. Not really too much is happening with the birds at that time of year. If they've hatched chicks, those chicks are probably pretty close to fledging, but they're not nesting. It's too hot to do captures. We spend more time in the office at that time, and that kind of rolls into once the temperature starts dropping, that starts our capture season. So we try to capture birds if their transmitters fail to give them new transmitters. We're also preparing the pen if we need to do any work at the release pen for a new batch of juveniles for release. And then capture season sort of just rolls right into breeding season, which the last 2 years has started in January and has gone until like June or July.
It's earlier and earlier every year.
So we're coming up on Super Bowl Sunday, so we're in early February.
We have 2 pairs
We have
sitting on
two
nests.
nests right
You
now.
have 2 pairs on nests right now.
One nest is due next week.
Next week.
Yes. They were our earliest ever last year, and they
beat that
jumped
by,
ahead by like 10 or 11 days this year.
So that's crazy to think about because, just,
It's crazy.
I don't know what it is, 4 or 5 hours to the west of here, we're going down to the wintering grounds at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, and those birds are
Just lollygagging on their wintering ground.
Months
February,
before
March,
they
April,
nest.
May. I mean, at least 4 months from being on their nests and 2,500 miles away.
Yeah.
Yep.
And just stone's throw over here, they're going already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we just came from the Audubon, the Freeport McMoran
Audubon
Species Survival Center, mouthful of words there, talking with Richard Dunn and Becca Grieser, and they're getting cranked up there too for chick season. When I first met you all, I went to them first and was with a cohort of birds that were captive raised or reared. What do we say? Do we say
Either one.
What is rearing? What does that mean?
Raising.
Raising. Same thing. Okay. Anyway, they went from
use it
they either went from egg or chick up to the point
To a bird.
that
Yeah.
they were how many days old? Like
When we get them, they're roughly 5.5 to 6.5 months old.
okay.
It sort of depends on, when the eggs are laid and the chicks hatch at the captive centers, but roughly, 5.5 to 6.5 months old.
Okay, so I was with this cohort of birds and keepers and Richard watching the last couple days before they got put into cardboard crates, put in the back of a van, drove down the highway to come here
Yep.
to White Lake and be passed off to you two and others, and they got their jewelry,
Yeah.
and then you took them out into the marsh and released them. Can you talk about that process, how it works, and if it works?
For decades now, whooping crane chicks have been hatched and raised in captivity and then released through, the various different projects that we've talked about. Obviously, not every bird that gets released is going to survive, but there's birds in the EMP who are, I don't know how old their oldest one is now, probably approaching 20 years.
22. I'm sure there's 2002 birds still alive.
We've got birds here. Our oldest bird is 14. Well, our oldest bird that we've originally released here is 14. We have a bird that we transferred here from the Florida population who will be 27. Yeah, 27.
My goodness.
Yeah, 27. So they're long lived. I mean, obviously some don't make it. Some only make it a year. Some only make it a couple years, and then others, for whatever reason, luck, just being slightly
Naive.
more wary, slightly whatever makes one bird slightly different from another might factor into whether or not they make it. But so captive reared birds can definitely survive in the wild and go on to reproduce. We're not yet seeing that in sort of high enough numbers.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a challenge over all the populations. But it definitely works, but it's a very labor intensive process. And yeah, it's certainly the work of lots of partners because the eggs get maybe moved down from Wisconsin to Audubon. And then, if they hatch and the chicks are successfully raised, then they come over to us for release, and then hopefully they survive and we go on to track them for years and years.
So take us on a trip on that release day.
On the release day? Well, when you were here, we just released them immediately into the open pen, but typically we have put the birds that we get, they come here, we band them, they go into a top netted pen for a short amount of time, and then we release them from that top netted pen and then provide supplemental food around and at the pen for however long they stick around.
So the top netted pen is not just right at the bunkhouse over here at the White
Correct.
Lake Epicenter. So would the birds come in the door at
The
White
birds,
Lake in their
birds come in the
cardboard
door.
boxes?
we have been banding them in our old office area just so we don't have to worry about weather,
Right.
either if it's raining or hot, mainly. And then we put them back in the box after we band them and take them on a boat down to our release pen, which is a couple miles down the canal, and take them out of their boxes one by one and carry them out to the pen and let them go into the pen. But we do all this in costume because they were reared. Most of them have been reared by costumes in captivity.
So I've seen all sorts of different kinds of costumes.
They're all sort of variations.
Yeah, so tell us about the Louisiana costume.
So probably like the costumes that we use are very slightly different than I think what ICF and Audubon use, which I think are probably more similar to each other, where I think their hoods are just all fabric with like a mesh face covering. And the whole idea of the costume is not necessarily to look much like a whooping crane, but to disguise the fact that you're a person so that the birds don't imprint or get used to being around people or associate food with people. Our costumes are sort of more similar, I guess, to what the ultralight folks use, where they actually, and I don't quite remember, maybe because the pilots had to wear a helmet. At some point, those costumes evolved into basically it's a hard hat with then a hood over it. And honestly, we like the hard hats because we have a lot of really aggressive birds who will
Attack us.
and the hard hats have saved our faces on several occasions.
Yeah.
So that part of our costume looks a little bit different. And then I think some of the other captive centers have costumes where the end of the sleeves have some black fabric on them, sort of replicating like the black primary feathers.
Sure.
We don't bother with that because one of your hands is in a puppet anyway, so you're only going to see one wing, so we just don't.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the basic idea is we're still covered up in disguise. We still have a puppet head that looks like a whooping crane and they don't see us as a person.
Right.
So, but all variations on the same thing.
So these birds get taken out of the boat by you all in your costumes, and they get taken one by one, walked out into the marsh, into the pen. Mm-hmm. And as I remember the pen, it's about maybe like a half-acre enclosure. I mean, it's a fairly big enclosure that's got electrical
A couple strands of electric fencing
to keep predators out, right? It also, though, is an open pen, so the birds can fly out at any time. So if you're a whooping crane, if you're a young whooping crane that's 6 months old and is being released into the marsh, this has got to be a very daunting experience for it. So what's it like for these birds?
It's probably certainly a very different view from what they've had. I mean, it's still, and that's often why in almost every year, except I think that 1 year you were here, is they typically go into that netted portion of the pen for at least a short amount of time so that it's not such a shock, or so they can, have a few days to get used to, like, oh, where am I and what is this stuff on my legs? Mm-hmm. But the pen has been built intentionally in a very natural marsh habitat setting because we want the birds who are still young and learning and somewhat naive to be in good habitat. Mm-hmm. And so then when ultimately when they're released, they're free to go wherever they want to go. And at that point, there's not much we can do except hope they make good choices.
Yeah, so when they're released either out of the top netted pen or when you were here just directly in the open pen, that would be the first opportunity that they would have to just fly freely without any sort of cover. So some of them can look a little awkward at first, but they get the hang of it pretty quickly.
There's been a couple crash landings.
Yeah.
Some swimming in the canal.
Well, I remember being with you and I remember the release day, but then I remember coming back. I came back with both you, Sara, and Eva at different times over the course of a couple-day window because you were monitoring them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when they stay around the pen, we do go out in the beginning for about a week at roost time just to make sure they're roosting in appropriate locations, although pretty much anywhere in the marsh would be appropriate. It's more like make sure you're not on the levee or something like that. So for about a week, we'll go out and do the roost checks, and then after that, we just go out during the day and check the food and just see if they're around. But over the last few years, they've sort of left the pen pretty quickly. So we remove the food if nobody's there. If adults come in and they're aggressive because they want the food, then we remove food because of that as well.
The year that I was there was an adult pair that was their part of their territory.
Yeah, they were, I think, pretty aggressive
Yeah.
that year. So yeah, it just depends on what older birds come back and sort of how they interact and behave. In years past at our previous release site, sometimes, we had a single, younger male or female who was, when we had larger groups to release, they became a submissive bird and weren't able to sort of dominate. But with smaller groups, or if the pair is really aggressive and they want that to be food and want that to be their space, then they can often, sort of chase away the chicks. So it's always sort of a balancing act. This year we had a number of adults in the marsh.
But nobody ate the food.
Nobody ate the food,
So
and nobody
what's
was
the food?
particularly aggressive.
It's a pelleted crane, specific for crane diet. We usually get a couple bags from Audubon when they bring the cranes over.
It's what
So
they're
the
already
same
used
stuff.
to eating.
They
So
eat
it's
it.
coming out of a feeder, basically, does it spit out the food, or do they have to come up and poke at it?
Yep. Yeah, it's like either a bucket feeder or like a deer feeder that they could eat out of, which is very similar to what they're used to eating out of at the captive facilities. And foraging and finding natural foods is very instinctual, so it really is just sort of a supplement. I mean, of course, especially when they're in the netted pen, they're going to take advantage of free food because free food. Once they're released, like Eva said, in the last couple of years, hardly anybody's sticking around and eating that food very much. So different groups of birds are different, but they're very capable of finding natural, food right away. So it's very much supplemental for that first little bit.
You've talked about size of these, the smaller groups and larger groups. What's the range in cohorts that you've had over the years, and what's the releases, and what's the sweet spot?
Well, the smallest group I think was the 4, and we've had 4
Several times.
Yeah,
now.
a couple times now. And then our largest groups were pretty big, but
I can't remember at one pen. Like in 2016 and 17, our total cohort, which weren't all in one pen at one time, were like 23 and 27 or 27 birds. But like that might have been split up into like
that was when we were releasing at 2 different
or
sites.
17, and a different place, a larger pen. So things have changed.
Maybe like 16 in one pen, like the White Lake pen.
Yeah.
But
We had 14 to 16 a couple years at the original White Lake pen.
How do you keep track of all those birds?
It's harder when there's more.
It's just,
they all have transmitters.
So let's go from the birds they're in the marsh, they're in the pens, and you monitor them for a week or so, and you put eyes on them, and then they start to disperse, and then the next part of your season begins.
Sort of merges into capture and a little bit less monitoring of the juveniles once they leave the marsh and kind of are doing their own thing.
So let's talk about the captures a little bit. How do you just go out and grab a 5-foot tall white bird with a razor sharp?
You saw.
Well, it's easy when they don't like us and they want to attack us.
The weirdest thing for me was first time I went out with you to do that, we first stopped at the grocery store and got green grapes.
Yeah.
It's like, what are we doing here?
Green grapes are like the candy for whooping cranes for some reason. I mean, why? I mean, sometimes I think they use them in captivity because you could stick a pill in a grape if a bird needs medication, but it's not like a natural food they're going to find. I mean, in some places they would find like wild blueberries or other kinds of berries, but they love grapes, and it's green grapes. They do not
so you've tried
like
that
red
before.
grapes. They like
It's not
green
the same.
grapes.
Picky.
So if we're going to try to catch a crane, we use the costume because most of the birds have been raised by the costume, so they're familiar.
And why are we catching cranes?
We want to replace transmitters so we can continue to keep track of them.
Okay.
So transmitter batteries last approximately 3 to 4 years, depending on the type of transmitter. Some will last longer than that. But if we're going to catch a bird, we use the costume. Obviously, go to where the birds are. Use grapes to sort of try to get them closer to us if they're not immediately interested in us as costumes. And if they come close enough, we'll do just a hand grab, which is what you saw twice. But if they don't want to come quite that close, we have an old fishing pole with a line that I make a little noose at the end and try to get them to step in and catch them by the leg.
So I'm Billy driving down the road in my pickup truck.
Oh, Lord knows what some people think when they've seen us out.
Vermilion Parish, and all of a sudden, I look to my left, and here's 2 people dressed up in ghost costumes with Star Wars helmets on, with fishing poles.
I must be quite a sight. Sometimes when I catch a glimpse of us, like in the truck mirrors, it's like, okay, but it works, so we just do it. And sometimes, if the bird is there, we'd rather be further from a road or where people can't see us as well, because most people drive past, but some people will stop and watch, and then that can be disruptive to the birds. But if the bird is there, we take advantage of the opportunity. So sometimes people probably get, Lord knows what they tell people when they go home, like, you're not going to believe what I just saw driving down the road. But
what are your interactions like with folks out on the landscape here? Because, well, let's describe what this landscape is, because there's a lot of marsh. Mm-hmm. It's also a lot of agriculture. This is an agricultural part of Louisiana.
Yeah. It is predominantly, there's a lot of sugar cane, but the cranes don't use sugar cane. So this area has a lot of rice and crawfish agriculture, and the cranes use that. So we spend a lot of time on private farm property once we've obtained permission from the landowners and farmers. We have birds that live full-time on private property in rice and crawfish agriculture who never come back to the marsh. And then there's other birds who are more marsh birds, but, come out of the marsh and use, ag at different times of the year. So there's sort of different birds, but I don't think that was initially anticipated when this project got started. I think the thought was, there's lots of marsh habitat. These are marsh wetland birds. They'll stay in the marsh. But to a crane, who gets up and initially flies away, or if you're in an airplane and you can see the amount of sort of shallowly flooded habitat in the form of crawfish fields this time of year and going through the spring, which to a crane is very similar to a marsh, is huge. Like, there's so much of that available. And so when they find that, and then if they find that and they're like, hey man, this is great, like I can literally stay all day here, I'm safe to stand and roost at night, I can feed here all day, it has everything they need. Mm-hmm.
And the farmers want to keep the crawfish fields about the same level, so there's not too much fluctuation in the water level when they're farming.
I see. Okay.
Which that then makes it very nice for the cranes that choose to nest there, because you've sort of got a stable source of, water of the appropriate depth in habitat that the cranes want to be in.
These crawfish fields are also rice fields, right? Or most
it's a rotational.
So in Nebraska, where I come from, it's rotation of corn and beans, right? So it's down here, it's mostly rice and crawfish.
Right.
If you're an agricultural wetland like that, where you've got water in it with crawfish, and do they drain those wetlands before then they plant rice? What's that process like? What's the farmer doing?
Yeah, it can vary some depending on the farm, or sort of if they're further north, whether or not they'll be able to get, when they can plant rice. Obviously, we're talking sort of various degrees, but further north they have to maybe wait a little bit longer. They might have cooler temperatures a little bit later into the spring, cool being relative.
Louisiana is not a very big state.
Right. Well, some people will have those fields flooded in the fall for waterfowl hunting, and then it might transition into, crawfish later in the winter going into spring if they're done hunting, or they might just be flooding them up sort of in November, December to get crawfish started. And crawfish, harvesting starts depending on when, water temperature and, how much they're seeing. But when that slows down, then they'll drain their fields, and then typically then they would plant a crop of rice, which then gets harvested in the fall. And then once they harvest it once, then it can regrow, and they can either sometimes get a second cutting from that, or they sometimes will just leave that second ratoon crop of rice to be the food for the crawfish going into the next winter. So
Right.
it sort of cycles back.
Right. Do cranes eat crawfish and rice?
Yes. They're very opportunistic. They will eat all kinds of stuff, but they do eat crawfish and rice as well.
What do the farmers think of that?
We haven't really had that many farmers who have expressed concern over it. Generally, I would say the farmers and the landowners are they're fine with the cranes being on the property. Not gung ho and super excited, but not like negative about it. They're kind of in the middle for the most part. We have some on both ends of the scale.
I imagine since whooping cranes are very territorial, there's a lot of wading birds down here in Louisiana. Do they protect territories and shoo off egrets and
we do see cranes chasing
ibis and
other birds off. So
yeah. I think that's one of the other things sometimes too. I think sometimes new farmers or landowners, and I think it's gotten less, is probably just word of mouth. More people, now as opposed to 10 years ago, know about the project or have heard from their neighbors or heard something somewhere along the way. But, sometimes when we meet somebody new or talk to somebody new, they're a little concerned. Obviously, whooping cranes are very large. They do eat crawfish. They, just sometimes, I think we had somebody one time that said, oh, I heard they eat a sack of crawfish a day. Well, a sack of crawfish is like 35 pounds. This is a 15-pound bird. They're not going to eat 35 pounds of crawfish in a day. And when we're out there monitoring them or, observing them, they do eat crawfish, but they're also eating tons of other things, snakes and frogs and snails and things so tiny we can't even identify them. So they're not exclusively eating crawfish. And because they're territorial, there's a family or a pair of cranes or occasionally a larger group of younger birds, but there's not 100 cranes like there might be 100 ibis and 50 egrets and 20 great blue herons and 200 coots, and there's lots of other birds that are out there in much greater numbers.
I think most of the concern that comes from the landowners is if they have birds on their property, like, are we going to tell them that they can't do stuff? Which is not the case, because our birds are classified as non-essential experimental. So the farmers can still do whatever they want on their property. They could even drain a field if they needed to while there was an active whooping crane nest. We just ask them to please let us know if they're doing anything drastic so we can take some management action if we need to.
Well, the times that I've been with you, and I've driven around with you quite a bit, all your interactions that you've had with landowners have been positive.
Mm-hmm. I think I often use the word neutral. I think a lot of them are sort of neutral. Like, they're okay with the birds being there. And the most important thing from our perspective is they cooperate with us in that they let us access their property so that we can monitor the birds or catch a bird or monitor a nest or sort of do what we need to do. Their biggest concerns are they don't want to be told they can't do something, and they don't want us to rut up their farm roads, which fair enough. And so we are very respectful of their wishes, and if they want to be contacted every time we go on their property, or if they're like, no, just go do what you need to do, whatever they want. We do have a few that I think are more enthusiastic and positive and who will send us reports and ask more questions. And, and then I think very, very few who are negative.
Yeah. Well, it sort of gets back to the thing I said about you two wearing capes, being superheroes out here. We're not talking about a small little area that you're looking at. I mean, Eva, I know you get in an airplane.
Yeah.
Fly a broad stretch of this country to identify birds. And I know that when I've been out with you all on your long days that you have in the field, we're covering a lot of territory. How much territory are we talking about right now with whooping cranes in Southwest Louisiana?
I would say the greatest concentration is probably around White Lake, but we do have birds that nest closer to the Texas border and up near Bunkie, and those locations are about an hour and a half from our office, and then we have birds kind of all up in between. So it's very unlike the eastern migratory flock, who mostly has been concentrated on the National Wildlife Refuges where they've been raised and released.
Right.
Yeah, our birds are spread over quite a wide area.
And I think in some ways that provides a secondary safety net. Like when people ask like, oh, how about the hurricanes or like severe like rainstorms that we get, you know, that might flood an area. Hurricane can impact a wide area, but it's not going to likely impact every parish that, you know, we have birds in. I mean, the birds have been fine through all the hurricanes anyway, but, you know, or if we get, you know, some kind of severe storm, it's not likely going to impact all the different areas because our birds, just like want birds in Texas and the Eastern Flyway in Louisiana, even within Louisiana, our birds are fairly spread out.
What are the biggest challenges today from you all's standpoint with these birds? And you're at your number now is about at what, 80?
Unfortunately lower.
Low 70s.
It was not a great year this past year for mortality. Yeah. So
is there a reason for that you can point to?
Just bad luck.
Yeah, it was just a bad year. I mean, there's going to be, I think, years that are good and bad, and this was hopefully just a particularly bad year, and hopefully we'll be on the upswing and have better years.
Yeah. We had a number of birds hit power lines this year, and a couple get shot. So, and then just natural, probably predation events. But it was just a bad year for mortality.
I mean, that's a big deal, though. You know, I mean, there's still not a lot of birds in this, and you know, you talk about power lines aren't going away.
Yeah,
a lot of them out there. They'll never not be there. Mm-hmm. And we all struggle with shootings here. It comes and goes, right? But that's an issue, and I mean, I know you're out beating the drum all the time about education, about these birds. You go and place or whooping crane information centers around libraries and schools and so forth, moving from parish to parish, right? You have a lot of landowner contacts. How frustrating is that when that happens?
It's extremely frustrating. I think this year was particularly frustrating because we had a number of shootings percentage-wise that had been the highest compared to other reintroduced populations within the first decade of the project. And then we sort of really made some efforts to increase some education and outreach, and ICF stepped up and helped with that and has some outreach folks who work down here now. And the last couple of cases that we had before, they helped us, and then local Audubon to really sort of advocate for those cases where somebody was actually caught and prosecuted, to advocate for more significant sentences, to, you know, send a message. And then we went through, I think it was almost 5 years. It was a significant stretch where we did not have any birds that were shot.
That we know of.
Or that we suspected. And so that felt and seemed really good, like we'd made some progress. And so then it felt like a step back to, you know, have birds shot again. We're always going to have to continue. I don't think we can ever sort of let up.
No finish line, is there?
Yeah. But it's also hard when you are still trying to grow an established population and your population is still really small. I mean, ultimately, yes, you want population goals, but we also are still focused a lot on individual birds, because at this point, when you've got a population that's, you know, less than 100 birds, every individual whooping crane counts. They matter, they're important. But when you've got such a small population, then the individuals really do matter.
So in 21, when I was here with you, there was a small cohort of birds that were, when they were released, their theme was around weather or, you know, big events. Mm-hmm. And one of the birds was named Lava. And I ended up photographing Lava a year or two later, not far from where we are now. And Lava went on to be a successful young male that found a mate, or a mate found him, and they ended up having a chick and so forth. And so every one of these birds, though, has a story. And you all are tracking these birds, touching these birds every year. Not all of them, of course, but you're keeping track of all of them. Do you get attached to them?
Some of them.
Yeah.
Some of them more than others. I think there's some that you know more.
Yeah.
Based on either where they live, so we see them more often, or because of their sort of personality and their location, we're able to catch them more often, so we can get transmitters on them more often. I mean, there's been birds which have been Eva's nemesis birds because they're very difficult to catch, despite numerous efforts. So yeah, sometimes it just depends. But some, I think that, yeah, either something that happens with them, or just because we have more interactions, or they do something weird or unusual, or then, you sort of get to know them a little better.
So I'm going to ask each of you to tell me a story about a bird. Bird that you know, that you care about.
This maybe was the first time I was actually scared of a crane. But we were out trying to catch a female of a pair and using the noose. And I had the noose set up kind of on a levee adjacent to the marsh. And she did step in it, and I pulled the noose. And Sarah, you were pretty close there with me. And the male was also sort of hovering around. So when we caught the female, the line for the noose was taut, and he sort of walked right into it, and it, prevented him from continuing on that way. And I feel like I could just see a switch in his head click. He's like, okay, well, now I'm going to attack you. And he was pretty aggressive. Yeah. Sarah took the bird. We had another coworker out with us, and that crane chased him around a hay bale. Jeez. He chased us, and Philip was running in a circle around a big hay bale, and that crane was chasing him.
So we have one bird in our hand that we want to get away so that we can ban the transmitter as quick as possible, and another crane that is literally chasing us.
full out, I'm gonna kill you.
Dang. And again, 5 foot tall, tallest bird in North America, 7-8 foot wingspan.
They can be intimidating for sure.
Bills are super sharp.
I've been scared numerous times by several different cranes.
That was the first time I was maybe actually scared,
but not the last.
Probably both have scars on your bodies or battle wounds, right?
Yeah, one on my nose too. Some pretty good bruises when they jab us with their beaks.
Mm-hmm.
All in the name of science.
What about you, Sarah?
There's probably a couple. There's 2 females. Gosh, one female is 7'11". She is one of our oldest females. She was the first female to nest here in Louisiana. A couple things about her. She actually picked the territory for her and her mate, which in whooping cranes, males typically pick the territory, but sometimes females do. So she picked the territory. She met her mate down here at White Lake and took him back up to what became their territory, which was near where she'd spent time as a yearling bird. Yeah. Unfortunately, with that first mate of hers, they nested for a number of years and 2 times every year and seemed to be really good incubators, but the eggs were infertile. So they never had a chick until we did a swap and gave them one time. And then unfortunately, there was a terrible storm and the farm flooded and the chick disappeared. So she's just been through a lot, and then she's a survivor, but continuing her sort of tragedies in her life. Her mate was shot and killed. So that was obviously terrible. She luckily found a new mate pretty quickly. And with that mate, they have produced fertile eggs and have now become one of our most successful pairs, hatching and rearing chicks, including a set of twins a couple years ago. So she's old. I've known her for a long time. Yeah. She's sort of been through a lot. I think one of the other things about her is that she's been on that same property nesting since 2014. And that landowner was always friendly and cooperative, but a little bit skeptical. And I felt like every year we'd sort of have the same conversation where he's like, okay, so you're not going to tell me I have to do something different or not do something. And we always tried to reassure him. And I think finally, just with time, and then especially I think when they started having chicks, and he literally watched, he finally saw, because I think years and years they saw the disappointment too, because they're the farmer and the landowner. They see those. Well, they definitely see those birds more than we do, because we just don't go up there very often. They're further away, and so I think then it got to a point where he would send us photos and updates, when they were raising chicks, and so we didn't even have to go up there because he was doing the monitoring for us.
Awesome. Yeah.
And so I think he sort of got around where I think he believed us, he trusted us, something clicked in him that he really, I think he always thought the birds were neat, but I think there was a little bit of just, really, is this really going to be okay? Because it's a working farm, they want to be able to keep doing what they're doing, there's money involved on a farm, so, and I think now he doesn't ever sort of voice those concerns again. So I think she sort of, helped get us to that point with him, because she's been so consistent on his farm, for 10 years, going on 11 years. So I think she's pretty neat.
She also gets a crazy look in her eye when we're
Yeah, she's a little scary too. She's a little scary.
We have photographs of her, right?
The Nest camera, and her mate is the one who opened it up.
Yeah, that one.
It was like the last picture from my camera was the thing looking eyeball to eyeball right into it. Yeah.
But we got a few before he figured out how to open up the box and expose the batteries and twist it and turn it and whatever all he did.
We've put time-lapse cameras out, I have with YouTube, some on nests and then some on landscapes. And you both use cameras too. You use game cameras. Can you talk a little bit about that side of your monitoring and research and how that helps you?
So we use the cameras mostly, I would say, to sort of get the end result of the nest, but it does give us information about incubation and if there's any disturbances. But it really helps to know if a chick hatches. And then this last year, the cameras helped us know that, for example, one nest, a chick did hatch and it died the same day, and you could see it in the pictures kind of floating dead near the nest, which we would have never known that otherwise. It didn't even survive for one day. So they really help with the end result.
We can look back at Nest camera photos and look at the condition of feathers on birds, and it can give us an idea if the bird molted. Like if we see them the next year, we're like, oh, wait a minute. And we can look back and be like, oh, well, it had that one darker primary, or the feathers looked really nice then. So it's primarily Nest, but there are some other information and uses that we sometimes get out of that as well.
How many cameras do you put out in a year typically?
We generally just put cameras up on birds that are in crawfish fields because they're more easily accessible. I don't know, maybe like 4 or 5 pairs might get a camera in a year. We'll put them up on first nest or re-nest, or you know, if timing works out for stuff. There are a few birds that have destroyed cameras, so
they don't get cameras anymore.
We maybe won't put cameras up on them. We did put a camera up the other day on one of our pairs who's currently sitting, even though last year the male sort of knocked the camera over into the water and ultimately destroyed it. But
we used the mount that we used for your camera.
We used one of our not as nice cameras with a different mount, so we'll see.
Then we wouldn't be quite as sad if the camera got destroyed.
So how those cameras, you have them set at an interval, or are they capturing movement, or are they just taking pictures at regular interval?
Regular intervals. So
5 or 3 or 2 minutes. What is it?
It's varied recently. Some of them are every minute. Some of them have been like every 3 minutes, especially on pairs where we already have like tons and tons of years of data on them. And then if they hatch a chick, then we will typically reprogram them to take photos, maybe just kind of at dusk to dawn when they would be at the nest with their chicks, so we don't get a bunch of pictures of an empty nest during the day when they're off foraging.
Right. And those cameras are placed how far away from the nest typically?
I think we've had some as close as like 4 meters, but maybe even a little bit less than 4 meters. But
I feel like there was one that was maybe just shy of 4 meters. But
we just kind of eyeball it.
Yeah.
We place them outside of the donut, and if there's crawfish trails in the way, we obviously don't want to block those for the farmers. So.
Well, the cool thing that I've seen out of the pictures that you've shared with me over the years is, they provide a lot of visual data, obviously, for you to learn from, but some of them are ridiculously beautiful. too. I mean,
And there's a couple funny ones too.
we're
Yeah,
looking at one
that's a pretty one.
where we're doing the recording here in this conference room. There's a beautiful picture of a whooping crane. It looks like unison calling, standing on a nest in the middle of a
That's a crawfish field.
And it's at night. It's in infrared anyway. It looks like black and white.
It might have been early.
Might have been an early morning.
But yeah, like just as.
But that's a picture that you would paint, right?
It's a good one.
It is
Yeah. Yeah. Do you use those pictures in ways that aren't for science, but for outreach?
Yeah. I mean, we don't have time, and we have not gone through every single photo. It would be a dream if we.
You need an intern.
But we do. Yeah, we do. But we do, like Eva said, we often look sort of at the end result. So to see if something happened, so we know, like, okay, well, that egg broke or that chick hatched, or, get those sort of big data points. And then sometimes just in our quick scans through, we'll come across something that's particularly interesting or beautiful or hilarious or
Hilarious.
there's one Eva found when she was just scanning through, I can't remember now, it's been a couple years ago.
The male is standing on the nest with the chick, and the female's head is just coming in from the side looking directly at the camera.
But keep in mind, these aren't motion activated, so it's just programmed on a time. So it was just sort of perfect timing.
Right.
But so we have that one printed out when we go to like festivals or events, or we put it in, presentations, and everyone always loves that because it's just this perfect photo bomb picture.
Whooping cranes
It's
look
just-
weird from the front. To
Yeah, it's
begin
like their
with,
face
so.
gets distorted. So
You both have seen so much over this decade plus worth of work here. You've traveled hundreds of thousands of miles, I'm sure, at this point, if you would just add up all of your time. What has surprised you?
I think one thing, and I still think it sometimes when we contact a new landowner, is for the vast majority, when we contact somebody randomly and, basically ask to access their property, they say yes. We're not the federal government, we are state government, and different people have different opinions and thoughts on various forms of government.
Yeah.
But almost everybody says, yes, we can access their property. Again, some of them want to know just so that they know that we're out there. And their biggest thing is, if it's wet, don't drive and mess up the roads.
Sure.
And sometimes I just think like, would I say yes? I mean, probably if I was interested in it, but I think sometimes that surprises me that just almost everybody says, sure, you can go on my property. And that, I don't know, that surprises me a little bit. I mean, we're obviously incredibly grateful for that, but.
Yeah.
I guess one of the differences I noticed coming from the eastern migratory population down here is not only is the property owned by somebody, but it's often farmed by somebody else. So getting the most logical contact can sometimes be a little tricky because there's just more than one person who has investment in that piece of land. And also in the first few years, at least, I felt like people in the Eastern Flyway, there were more, I'm not saying there's more birders per se, but we received a lot more reports of cranes when I was in that population. And I know our birds are being seen by folks, but I think the majority or more people would report them for the EMP than I feel like maybe they do down here.
So we've talked about a lot this morning, but I want to pull it back to this challenge of reestablishing whooping cranes in a place that they were historically, but were extirpated by about 1950 or so, and they were absent from this landscape for 60 plus years. There's been other reintroduction attempts that have failed. Rocky Mountain population failed. Florida failed. Wisconsin and Louisiana are now, the Eastern Flyway population, Louisiana population are giving it a go. And just because something fails doesn't mean that it's done. It just means you learn and you keep going. So what keeps you all going? Because what you do is hard. I know it's hard. I know it's hard on you physically, it's hard on you mentally, it's hard on your heart. Sometimes, even though you can, sort of put yourself in the box of the scientist, you're still human beings. You deal with this stuff, and I'm just constantly amazed by all the people that I've met in conservation over the years that dedicate themselves to a landscape or a species or some sort of an effort. What keeps you two going?
I think for me, a couple of things. I think one, sometimes when you have an opportunity to talk to new folks, when you do a presentation or when you meet somebody and they haven't heard, it sort of re-energizes when you get to give, it sort of puts a fresh perspective, because it's very easy to get bogged down in like the data entry or like the hot, muddy field conditions or like the bummer times when we're picking up dead eggs that didn't hatch or a dead bird or something. Like, I mean, that's part of it, but it's not a fun part of it. But when you get to sort of refresh your perspective of like, why are we doing this? And what's, all that when you're talking to somebody new, I think I always like that. And I think also for me, sometimes like particular sort of wins with, certain birds, our birds struggle in some ways, but we've got some really aggressive, badass parents. Like they are good parents. And, so when we see that, or when we have sort of a surprise success or something. Oh, I know. We had a really good surprise last year. We had this pair. It's actually this bird that we moved over from Florida. She was a wild hatch bird over there. She did great when we released her. She paired, but for 3 years.
I think 3 years.
3 years they nested, and like they don't have functional transmitters, so we were never exactly sure when their nest started or ended. So we always err on the side giving them, and they sat.
Like,
and then when, like
probably
like
over 40
days.
50. Yeah.
And then when we'd collect their eggs, there was never, any of those years, any evidence of the eggs even being fertile. So it's like, dang, this is maybe like a dud pair or something. So last year, thinking they're sort of a dud pair, like we set up a plan. Even one of our colleagues went out to actually fly a drone over to like see if their nest had completed, if they weren't sitting. I was actually, just for timing wise and stuff, I was driving to New Orleans to pick up a good egg. We were going to try and do a swap. And I'll let Eva tell it from here.
Yeah. Well, they had a chick.
Like a miracle baby.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the chick didn't make it very long, but that was like the first evidence that we had that they even had fertile eggs. So that was pretty exciting. And we had a similar pair actually in the EMP with infertile or non-viable eggs for years and years. And then one year they hatched their own egg and raised it.
So maybe it just takes, we say it. I don't know that I always believe it. Like sometimes some of them maybe it just takes longer. But that was shocking last year. Because I think I had ridden that pair off basically. And so then for them to just have this little baby, even though it didn't make it.
Yeah.
So, now now I have hope that they'll
Do it again.
and have a baby this year, and that they don't have to be one that we think about, okay, well, we need to get an egg to swap and try and give them something, because hopefully they'll just do it on their own.
Right. And you, Eva?
I think for me, even though we don't maybe see as much success in reproduction as we would hope, like the ones that are able to hatch and raise chicks, that's pretty exciting, and that's the goal of our whole population. So everyone is kind of a little boost. Yeah.
So you've said hope. Both of you have said hope. Both of you have said success. What does success look like here if, let's say, we're sitting in a bar and we're 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and we're looking back? What do you want success to look like, or what does success mean here in Louisiana?
And I would say it would be a self-sustainable population that maybe doesn't grow every year, but over the long term would slowly grow on its own and wouldn't require additional captive birds to be released. And maybe we don't need to monitor the birds as much anymore. So that's what I think it would look like.
As much as it drives us crazy that we've got an increasing number of unmarked birds, because it makes it hard to know who they are and where they are.
If they're still alive.
Like, there's a lot of uncertainty with that. But that's because we're having success. Like, those birds are unmarked because they were hatched and raised in the wild, and they either split off early from their parents, or their parents are wary, or whatever. We couldn't catch them.
Yeah.
We can't catch every bird. We caught 3 out of our 4 wild hatch chicks from last year, which was great, better than the last couple of years. So we like that because we like knowing individual birds and being able to track and identify. But those unmarked birds in and of themselves are a sign of success in the population.
Yeah.
I think we both come from having worked on reintroductions where every bird. It's very different from the wild population, the Aransas wood buffalo population, where the vast majority of those birds are not marked. So it makes us feel a little more uncomfortable when we've got more unmarked birds. It makes me feel more uncomfortable because there's less certainty. But that is success.
Yeah.
That they exist. So,
if you could describe whooping cranes in one word, Eva.
What?
Do say it first. I'm gonna have to think about this.
One word.
One word. You can probably use 2.
Okay, I'll say persistent. And the reason I say that, another reason it drives us nuts, is that our nesting season starts now in early to mid-January and goes till July. And that's because we have birds that, despite failing and not succeeding, try again and again and again. And although it makes us, sometimes we just please enough for the year, they have some kind of drive in them to keep going. I mean, even if they hatch and raise a chick, so they've sat on eggs for a month, they've raised a chick. We've had some that have raised a chick for almost a month. The chick dies or disappears. They take a 2-week break and then they try again, which makes their effort very long. So that instinct or drive or persistence in them, as much as it sort of makes us crazy sometimes, I think is sort of amazing.
Yeah. If we go out today for a little drive, what might we see?
Well, hopefully some cranes. It depends on where we want to go. We might be able to see one of our pairs that's on a nest. We might be able to see that bird that you photographed from a chick.
Yeah.
Lava, who we know and refer to as L321.
I keep track of all that.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, for us, their numbers become their names. So, us referring to 711 or 321 or W424, it's their name, just like anything else.
I wanted to ask you, because talking about this earlier off camera, do they get the name, or do they get the numbers, or their code, or their license plate, or whatever it is that you want to call it? Who assigns that to them?
We do.
You guys do. So when you get a bird, then they get the number letter combination.
And it's generally generally the order that they hatched that year and then the year that they hatched. So their number not only is their identifier for us, but it gives us more information without having to think, okay, who is Lava? When did he hatch? Like, what bird is that again? That would, if we went by the names, that's sort of, it would be harder for us to know like their age and stuff like that.
And like the themes, I think, help the captive folks, but they're also rearing them. So like 5 years ago, Lava, I wouldn't necessarily, you don't necessarily remember the theme because we weren't intimately involved with raising those birds. But yeah, the IDs give them information. But so we might be able to see that bird and his mate. They're not too far from here. Eva did see them doing some nest building a while back, but they haven't really done anything since. But they're not too far, so we might be able to see them. Hopefully, some other birds.
Can't wait. So you've talked about, you've also mentioned a few times in this conversation about the eggs not being fertile. Seems like
Infertile
that's
or like a very, very, they could also be super early dead embryos. You just can't tell. By the time we get them, they're just a horrible, rotten mess. So
They're not pleasant.
but yeah, so what we've seen in Louisiana is we do have a high rate of embryo mortality. So the eggs are fertile and the embryos are dying at various stages of incubation, and we're not really sure why that is. All of our birds come from the same captive flocks that the birds in Wisconsin and the EMP come from, and they don't have that issue in Wisconsin. So it's something to do with Louisiana, whether something from the outside is coming in during incubation or something is being passed on from the adults into the egg when the egg is being laid.
What could that be?
We're thinking right now we're going along the lines of some kind of bacterial infection, because we have had some eggs hatch in captivity from our pairs that have died from bacterial infections. And this last year, Audubon hatched out a chick and immediately treated it with antibiotics, and it survived, and we got it back and we released her into the wild. So that's sort of the path that we're going on now. And we have collected samples to send to our partners at the Alaska Science Center, and they're going to kind of take a deeper dive into the bacterial content of egg samples, and then also the bacterial content from eggshell swabs that we've taken.
Would there be a way to mitigate that if you do figure out that that is what it is, if you identify the problem?
That's the hard thing. Wide scale, I'm not sure. But part of it is we have to see what they even find. And we're actually having a call with them next week to sort of talk about preliminary results from what they've looked at from the analysis and the samples they've analyzed and stuff late last year. So we'll see what they've found so far and what they're thinking. So we've always, even before we collected those extra samples for that particular study, whenever we have an egg that doesn't hatch that we collect, we always open and examine that with our vet, and we would submit samples for bacterial culture. So we've got lots and lots of data about all the different kinds of naturally occurring bacteria that these eggs are full of. The question is bacteria coming in and killing the embryo, or is it sort of secondary to an embryo dying and basically degrading over time? And that we don't know as much. Hopefully the swabs from the eggshell will give us an idea of here's what's on the outside to start with, and does that translate? But we did see last year, finally, there was starting to see one bacteria that seemed like it was in almost every sample. And that, I remember when we finally started seeing that, like it's a commonly occurring bacteria, and it's something that probably a slightly different strain can be found in cattle, and there's actually a cattle vaccine for that. So it's not impossible to develop a vaccine for something.
Yeah.
You know, how we get that into birds, is that feasible? Is that realistic? I mean, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, but it happens with other species. And
right.
all that,
so, you know, we need to see what they find. And maybe some of what they find leads to sort of another question and some other things we need to look into. You know, we've also had some pairs where they seem to have some struggles and now they're doing better. I mean, we definitely have some that consistently have issues, and then others who consistently don't have issues.
Or one egg will be dead and one egg will hatch. So yeah, it's kind of all over the place.
The inconsistency makes it hard to figure out. And then even if we figure it out, is there a solution that can be implemented? Or is it just a matter of more birds, larger population, and you have time, you sort of get rid of some of that because you lose some of your dead birds, or you've got more birds who are naturally successful for whatever reason. So
well, I imagine that you feel that this is, you know, the project has been going on for 14 years ish. Feels like a long time in terms of nature's time. It's not very long at all, right? So we always tend to look at things in our own human scale.
We have to remind ourselves to be patient sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
Or I do.
And persistent,
Yeah.
right? You know, But the thing I guess I see, the last picture in the book,
It's
in
a
my
good
book,
one.
is a good one. And it's a picture, of a bird on a nest with a chick here in Louisiana. And you get these chicks to that stage, you get the ones that do hatch. Usually mom and dad do a pretty good job, right? And they're learning their way. You got some pairs out there that know what they're doing. And it just takes time. And like you said, there's more white birds out there without any jewelry on that you're never probably going to know exactly who they are anymore. But that is kind of the point, right? It's almost
Ultimately, we want more birds than we can track or that we need to track. So
Yeah. With Richard Dunn yesterday, he said, I'm going to paraphrase him here, but he said something to the effect of, I hope one day that, people are driving down the road and they go, oh, look, there's another whooping crane. And then just keep going. That was success to Richard.
Yeah.
And it feels kind of similar here. When I started this project, my idea was to focus specifically on the wood buffalo Taransis birds. And very quickly I began to realize that you really can't. You can do that if you put them in a box and put up a big high wall, but everything that's happening today is all connected back to those birds, and those birds are connected to these birds, and these birds are connected to the Wisconsin birds, and then all these people are all connected to each other. So if you were going to try to draw a diagram connecting all of that, it would look like this ridiculous spider web, but everybody's connected. And I think that's one of the great powers in the crane conservation community of all of us craniacs out there is that kind of connectivity. And you're not just, we all aren't just people that know each other. We, for a lot of us, we're friends. And you need that. You need that today in a world that sometimes when you wake up, you just want to go back to bed, Yep. But yet you two get up every morning.
Most mornings.
So it's been a real honor talking to you both today.
You as well. Thank
you very much. These are the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Thanks for joining, folks. Stay tuned.